Ladies and gentlemen, brace yourself because what just detonated out of Minnesota in the last 72 hours is not a scandal. It is a government-shaking, career-ending, internationally watched explosion that no one, especially Tim Walz, was prepared for. And tonight, I'm going to walk you through every single piece of this political bomb that now has splattered across the national stage. And for the first time in modern U.S. history, over 480 state employees, not anonymous sources, not some political opponents, but actual Minnesota government workers have publicly accused their own sitting governor of hiding, enabling, and protecting a billion-dollar fraud scheme with tentacles that are stretching all the way to Somalia. And according to some new reporting, possibly even into these terror-linked networks that federal investigators are now quietly analyzing. This is no longer just a fraud case, guys. This is a national security emergency unfolding right here at home. And the moment Tim Walz was confronted about it on live television, he broke. He cracked. He collapsed in real time, blaming Trump, blaming prosperity, blaming pretty much everything except the one thing that mattered, his own administration's failures. So tonight, President Trump's DOJ is watching, federal prosecutors are watching, and millions of Americans are watching the same question explode across the country. How did Minnesota become a billion-dollar cash pipeline, and why was Tim Walz fighting harder to silence the whistleblowers than the criminals? Let's get into it, guys. Hit the like button and subscribe. Let's start with the blast that cracked this entire scandal open, because when over 480 Minnesota state employees, not some activists, not some politicians, but actual workers inside of Walz's own Department of Human Services stood up and publicly accused their governor of facilitating fraud, that alone would have been historic. But what happened next is what turned this into a political nuclear event. Their statement didn't go viral. It went thermonuclear, tens of millions of views in hours, spreading across Minnesota, across all 50 states, and straight into Washington, D.C. They said Walz didn't just ignore fraud. He built the environment that allowed it. He shielded the people doing it, and he retaliated against anyone who tried to expose it. Now, think about it. Why would you do all of those things? As a governor, why would you block all of those investigations? Are those the acts of a guilty man? Drop a guilty if you think Tim Walz was in on it. Now, this wasn't a complaint. This was a public mutiny against their own governor. Now, if you think Tim Walz is innocent, drop an innocent down below. And so once you have that many insiders revolt all at once, something is deeply, catastrophically wrong. Now, let's take this a little bit deeper, because the whistleblower revolt, this wasn't just one program or one rogue nonprofit. This is about an entire fraud architecture that's operating under Tim Walz's watch. We're talking about the now infamous Feeding Our Future scandal, over $250 million stolen from federal child nutrition programs during COVID. Now, that alone would have been one of the largest fraud schemes in U.S. history. But according to the federal prosecutors, state auditors, and now these 480 plus DHS employees, that was only the entry point into something far bigger. In fact, something far darker. And the DOJ says that the real number now exceeds $1 billion across multiple Minnesota programs. And the whistleblowers, they're saying that the final number could reach an unimaginable $10 billion. $10 billion. Vanished through nonprofits, shell restaurants, fake meal claims, and politically protected networks. This wasn't fraud. This was industrial scale looting of the taxpayer. All right, now here's where this scandal jumps from shocking to absolutely explosive, because according to federal prosecutors, investigative journalists, and now the whistleblowers themselves, the fraud inside of Minnesota wasn't just staying in Minnesota. Massive sums, I'm talking tens of millions of dollars at a time, were allegedly routed overseas, much of it to Somalia, through cash couriers, informal wire systems, and Hawala-style transfer networks that investigators say are notoriously difficult to trace. Now, I want you to think about this just for a second, okay? This is money that was meant to feed children in Minneapolis. This was allegedly being vacuumed out of the country through channels that the Treasury Department has warned about for years. City Journal called Minnesota a cash pipeline to Somalia. The New York Post reported that funds were converted to cash and then moved overseas. And the whistleblowers are saying that Walz's administration knew that these networks were operating. Now, if that is true, the scandal isn't local, it's international. Now, before we go any deeper into these overseas transfers and how far all this money may have traveled, let me pause for something that matters just as much to you and your family, because nothing hits harder than finding out that your ER doctor wasn't covered. One moment of crisis turns into months and months of bills, stress, and panic that you never saw coming. This is why Chapter exists. They make sure that your Medicare plan protects you in emergencies and not abandons you. They check your coverage in ways that most people don't even know are possible. And the truth is, most people are preventing the ER shock before it even happens. Most people are calling the phone number at the bottom of your screen there, or they're visiting askchapter.org/Ron. That phone number again is 909-563-8279. And let me just ask you plainly, do you want your retirement drained? And speaking of people taking action, look at one of our own subscribers just said. So Paul Ellis said, at least Chapter saved me $265 a month on medication. Thanks, Chapter. So Paul, I just want to thank you. Seriously, stories like yours, they really help people realize that you don't have to be trapped by bad coverage. All right, so let's get back into it, okay? And so, before the newest claims, and let me be very clear, these claims are coming from analysts, journalists, and federal investigators, not these internet rumors. They're suggesting that some portion of the stolen Minnesota funds may have traveled through financial channels that are used by extremist groups, including Al-Shabaab, the Somali-based terrorist organization responsible for attacks across East Africa. Now, City Journal's reports warned that the same Hawala corridors used to transport stolen welfare dollars, they have historically been used by the very groups that are tied to militant networks. Treasury officials under President Trump, they have said that they're now reviewing whether any Minnesota-linked transfers intersected with terror finance red flags. So no one is claiming that Walz intentionally funded these extremists. That's not what I'm saying. But the allegation that his failures enable these pathways, well, that is politically and nationally devastating. Now let's talk about something that's even more disturbing than the fraud itself, shall we? How Tim Walz allegedly reacted when honest state employees tried to stop it. Because according to this viral whistleblower post, and remember, this isn't one or two disgruntled staffers. This is over 480 DHS workers, okay? The governor's office didn't just ignore fraud reports. They punished anyone who filed them. Whistleblowers claim careers were threatened. Investigators were sidelined, reports were buried, employees were monitored, whatever that means, probably more micromanagement. Even some say that their families were targeted with intimidation tactics. That's not negligence. That's not oversight failure. That is a coordinated retaliation network designed to protect the very fraud rings that these employees were trying to expose. In fact, the workers describe a system where telling the truth meant risking your livelihood, your job, and staying silent meant enabling corruption. So what do? If even half of this is true, Walz wasn't asleep at the steering wheel. He was welding the steering wheel shut. And this is where the political volcano erupts. I mean, thanks to revelations from the New York Times, we now know that internal investigators warned Governor Walz about the fraud years before it even became national news. But according to officials inside the Attorney General's office, Walz feared that cracking down on nonprofits tied to Minnesota's Somali community would risk alienating a core Democratic voting bloc. Now let that sink in for a second, okay? Investigations delayed, audits ignored, warning signs dismissed, all to avoid political backlash. Whistleblowers say that this wasn't incompetence, this was calculation. Walz allegedly prioritized protecting his political coalition over protecting taxpayer money. And the moment that staff pushed a little bit too hard, he shut him down. This turns the scandal from mismanagement into intentional political shielding of fraudulent networks. And under President Trump's DOJ, that motive is about to become a legal problem. Now, let's revisit the moment that the entire country watched Tim Walz break on national television. Because when he sat down on Meet the Press, every political insider already knew that he had been forced to address this billion-dollar scandal, but no one, including the White House press corps, expected the meltdown that unfolded live on air. Pressed on why Minnesota suffered the largest welfare fraud scandal in U.S. history, Walz didn't just take responsibility like a man. He didn't apologize. Instead, he delivered one of the most incoherent pivots ever broadcast. He blamed national politics. He blamed Inspector General cuts. He blamed prosperity for attracting criminals. He even claimed Minnesota's success made it a magnet for fraudsters. Now, at one point, he tried claiming that he takes responsibility for putting people in jail. This is a comment that instantly went viral because it answered none of the accusations. What the heck is this guy even talking about? Is he senile? This was the clearest sign yet. Walz wasn't leading Minnesota. Walz was drowning in scandal. And listen, before we move on to President Trump's reaction to this, because that part gets really wild, I need to tell you about something that honestly shook me this week. So a 61-year-old woman tried to refill her medication, and the pharmacist told her that she already had in Texas. And she's never been to Texas, not even once. That is medical identity theft, and it shows just how deep this problem goes in America right now. It's no longer just the credit cards or bank accounts. Criminals are now using people's medical information, prescriptions, insurance, even doctor visits. This is why LifeLock matters. You see, LifeLock monitors more than just your credit. They track your identity across places you'd never think anyone could reach. And with 30 days for free, you can actually see the threats long before they turn into financial chaos. Now, most people don't just assume that they're safe anymore. Most people protect themselves, because in a world where even your prescriptions can be stolen, doing nothing isn't an option. Click the link in the description down below and get your free 30-day trial today. All right, so let's get back into President Trump's response, because he didn't hold anything back. And so if Walz's meltdown was the spark, President Donald J. Trump's response, this was the explosion. So when asked directly about Tim Walz's conduct, the fraud, the cover-ups, the overseas money transfers, President Trump didn't hold back. He said what millions were already thinking. There's something really wrong with him. Trump accused Tim Walz of allowing criminals into the state, allowing billions in taxpayer dollars to disappear, and then failing to protect Minnesotans from the largest public funds fraud scheme that America's ever seen. And the way he said it, calm, direct, with that classic Trump cadence, kind of sent this clip viral across every major platform. Conservative media ran it nonstop. Even mainstream news outlets repeated it because the soundbite was just too devastating to ignore. Now, for Walz, already cracking under pressure, Trump's response wasn't criticism, or at least it wasn't just criticism. This was a national verdict. And so now here's where the ground really begins to shake beneath Tim Walz, because the scandal is no longer contained inside of Minnesota. It's now a full-blown federal investigation, and the Trump administration, they're treating it as the largest welfare fraud case in U.S. history. Look, federal prosecutors, they've already charged 78 defendants, and officials are saying more indictments are coming. Investigators describe this fraud network as complex, organized, and operating across multiple nonprofit fronts. We're talking shell restaurants and cash transfer systems. They're attacking international money laundering trails, missing millions, and cross-border transfers that may intersect with foreign criminal groups. And what's most damaging for Walz is this. Federal prosecutors say that the fraud thrived because oversight inside Minnesota collapsed. In private briefings, DOJ officials reportedly described Minnesota as a case study in systemic failure. And of course, every time investigators peel back another layer, the trail just keeps pointing back to the same office, Tim Walz's office. And so to understand how the scandal grew into a billion-dollar catastrophe, you really need to understand what Minnesota became under Tim Walz, a fraud magnet. Now, overnight, oversight didn't weaken, it practically evaporated. During COVID, the state's welfare and nutrition programs, they ballooned overnight. Nonprofits were approved with almost zero verification. Audits were waived, site checks vanished, paperwork standards collapsed. And in that chaos, fraudsters thrived. The clearest proof? One key defendant, Usman Shamira, had been kicked out of SNAP in 2015 for suspected fraud. Yet, under Walz's administration, he was welcomed back with open arms and a brand new child nutrition program, where he allegedly stole even more. Now, this is not being fooled twice. This is clearly systemic dereliction. I mean, Minnesota's DHS became so dysfunctional, prosecutors actually say that the fraud networks operated like open air markets, each one feeding off relaxed oversight and political negligence. Walz didn't just oversee a broken system, he oversaw a gold rush for criminals. And so as the scandal explodes across the country, conservative media has settled on a phrase that perfectly, essentially captures what just happened. Minnesota's Watergate. And honestly, it's not an exaggeration, because Watergate wasn't just about a crime. It was about the cover-up, the retaliation, the abuse of power, a corruption at the top. And this is exactly what commentators are saying is happening with the Walz administration. They're watching the whistleblower revolt, the retaliatory culture inside DHS, the politically protected nonprofits, the ignored audits, the buried reports, the billion-dollar losses, and now the allegations of international transfers. And they're saying that this is the biggest government-funded fraud network in modern American history. And so even without the terror funding angle, the scandal is still massive, but with the overseas funneling, with the Hawala networks, with federal investigators acting or asking national security questions, yeah, this isn't just fraud, folks. This is Minnesota's Watergate, and it's detonating under Walz in real time. And finally, what does this mean for the national level? Now that President Donald J. Trump is president again, well, it means that the entire machinery of the federal government is shifting its weight onto the scandal that Trump's DOJ has reopened these long dormant oversight offices. So check this out. So the Treasury is now pulling the Hawala transfer flags from the last 5 years. They're going deep. DHS is mapping international money trails. The FBI is reviewing whether Minnesota's fraud networks intersected with foreign criminal or extremist operations. And multiple agencies are preparing new rounds of indictments, all while Walt's inner circle is reportedly scrambling. They're lawyering up, they're bracing for subpoenas for years. Minnesota leaders thought that the scandal would stay quiet, it would stay local, it would stay contained, but the era is over. This is a new administration, one that's not afraid to call corruption what it is or follow the money wherever it leads. And now the billion-dollar truth is finally catching up to Tim Walz.